Everybody, so we have one issue on the agenda for today, and that's a study that has been performed on the decriminalization of marijuana. For those of you that are new to the Crime Commission, staff has worked since this was passed earlier this year. They'll be making a presentation, which may take some time, and then we've left the rest of the time available for public comment, which is why I assume that many of you are here today. So we'll start with the staff presentation by Mr. Draper. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, Colin Draper, Senior Staff Attorney, to present on the topic of decriminalization of marijuana. Today's topic presentation will be a general discussion on possession of marijuana laws in Virginia as well as across the United States, as well as the policy implications that would flow from the change to any of the current possession of marijuana laws. This study was initiated as a result of a letter request from Senator Norman, as well as two bills referred from the Senate Courts of Justice by Senators Lucas and Evan. I want to be clear from the outset that decriminalization is not the same as legalization. Decriminalization refers to removing the criminal penalties for possession of marijuana. However, marijuana would still be a civil offense, and marijuana would still remain a prohibited substance under the law. Currently, when we're talking about marijuana under Virginia law, marijuana is defined as any part of the cannabis plant, whether it be the plant itself, seeds, leaves, stem, flowers, or any resins or extracts from that plant. The active component in marijuana is THC, which is a Schedule I controlled substance under Virginia's Drug Control Act. Under the Drug Control Act, Schedule I substances are determined to have designated to have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use in the United States. There are various side effects that come along with THC, among them the euphoria, which is the high of the marijuana, hunger, and in extreme cases, psychosis. Reiterate again, the study focused on decriminalization. We did not extensively examine legalizing medical marijuana or the medical effects of marijuana or the effects on its user. The Joint Commission on Healthcare is currently conducting a study on the medical effects as well as the health effects of marijuana, and their presentation is available on their agency website. In conducting the study, staff began by reviewing available literature on the topic. We then analyzed Virginia laws as well as laws of the other 49 states, the federal government, and the District of Columbia. We wanted to get an idea of what was actually going on out in the field, so we conducted an informal survey of prosecutors, public defenders, and court-appointed attorneys to see how marijuana cases were being handled. We also consulted with individuals who are involved in the enforcement and practicing of enforcement of marijuana, and requested written public comments on the topic. We received a number of public comments, over 5,600 to be exact. Of those, over half of the comments we received were in support of decriminalization. There were about 107 that did not support, and then there were a variety that referenced legalization, medical marijuana, and the occasional manifesto against the government, which did not refer to marijuana at all. Before you, under your package, you do have a copy of agency positions specifically that were submitted to the written comment in regard to how certain agencies stand in regard to the topic of decriminalization. From this presentation, we hope to give you a general overview of possession laws across the United States, as well as the policy matters that come along with any movement toward decriminalization. We also gathered data in regard to the arrests, charges, and convictions in Virginia, which will be presented. And finally, we want to talk about the consequences that can stem from a conviction for possession of marijuana. The debate over marijuana has gone on for well over a century, and I don't believe there's anything that I'm going to say today that's going to change it one way or the other. What I can tell you in looking at the laws of other states, it does vary across the country as to how other states handle possession of small amounts of personal use quantity marijuana. 30 states and the federal government impose criminal penalties, of which 3 of those states don't authorize jail time for at least a first offense. Then you have 8 states plus the District of Columbia, which has legalized recreational use of marijuana. 7 states that impose civil penalties for possession of marijuana, and 5 states that impose a mix of civil and criminal penalties for the possession of marijuana. Before you'll see a map of the breakdown of those states, the red states being the states which have legalized marijuana, the blue states which impose civil penalties, the yellow which impose a mix of civil and criminal penalties, and the gray which impose criminal penalties. I draw your attention to your member packets. Behind tab 3 there is a copy of this map with those states listed out, and behind that map there are 3 different sheets. There's a sheet which lists the 3 states which do not authorize jail time for the first offense, which would be Missouri, Montana, and North Carolina. Behind that sheet is a list of the 7 states with civil penalties and the penalties for possession in those states. And then the third sheet is the list of penalties, which are the civil criminal blend. There's no easy way to categorize how each of them handles it. Each state addresses it in their own manner. But generally what you'll see is an escalating penalty structure amongst those states which have imposed civil or criminal civil blend penalties. In regard to what we discovered during this study, the current statute in Virginia regarding possession of marijuana was enacted in 1979 and remains in effect. A first offense is punishable by up to 30 days incarceration and a $500 fine. A second offense punishable by up to 12 months incarceration and a $2,500 fine. Additionally, any conviction or deferred disposition will result in the revocation of the offender's driver's license for 6 months by the Department of Motor Vehicles. Now, there is a first offender drug statute, 18.251, which allows for a first-time drug possession offender to avoid a conviction by entering into this first offender program. The program typically entails a deferred disposition, meaning the court finds that there's enough evidence to find a defendant guilty, but continues the case to give them a chance to complete conditions so that the charge may be dismissed. Generally, those conditions include probation, as well as some type of drug abuse education, testing or treatment, and community service. When you're looking at costs for a first-time marijuana possession offense, those can vary amongst a variety of factors, but generally speaking, if you have a defendant who is indigent, enters into that first offender program, and has a court-appointed attorney, you're looking at costs somewhere between $400 to $800 to that offender, depending on the type of probation that they're placed on. There are other optional fees in the code which can be imposed depending upon the locality. To better break this down behind tab 4 in your notebooks, there is a listing of the various costs and fees to illustrate what exactly an individual can be expected to pay. When looking at individuals incarcerated on a possession of marijuana charge, there are an extremely low number of individuals who actually serve jail time solely for possession of marijuana. We took a snapshot from the comp board on July 20th of 2017 to see exactly how many people were in custody solely on a marijuana charge. And what we found was there were 96 inmates on that date being held pre-trial in the jails, and 31 inmates being held post-trial serving a sentence. As of the fiscal year 2015 comp board report, it costs about $80 per day to house an individual in jail on an offense. The vast majority of arrests in the Commonwealth for possession of marijuana are for first-time offenses. When that arrest data is broken down by sex, age, and race, what we see is that males, young adults, and blacks are generally overrepresented in the total number of arrests as it relates to their overall general population in Virginia. There's also a fairly large attrition rate between the number of charges and the number of convictions for first offense possession. And what I mean by that is slightly over half of the charges actually end up resulting in convictions. In reviewing that data, we wanted to compare it to the informal surveys that we had sent out to Commonwealth attorneys, prosecutors, public defenders, and court-appointed attorneys. And generally what we received from that was in line for first offense marijuana possessions. What you're generally seeing is that the charge is taken under advisement pursuant to the statute. Other instances we've seen where it indicated it had been amended to another offense, such as possession of paraphernalia, and another indicated that it may be continued generally with conditions somewhat like a first offender case, but without going through the official first offender process. We also found that jail time is frequently waived on that first offense charge. In looking at the punishments for a second and subsequent offense in that survey, it was fairly well mixed between fine only, a suspended jail time with a fine, and active jail sentence with a fine. Data we received from the Sentencing Commission in regard to sentencing events for subsequent marijuana offenses showed that slightly over 30% of those sentencing events for possession of marijuana, second or subsequent, resulted in a jail sentence. And the median effective jail sentence for those 578 individuals was 15 days of actual time incarceration. When looking at the Virginia statute in specific, the statute itself does not set a threshold quantity which distinguishes between simple possession of marijuana and possession with intent to distribute. There is a 18-248.1, I believe, deals with distribution. Possession with intent to distribute over half an ounce, or less than half an ounce, is a class 1 misdemeanor. But there is no bright-line rule in terms of what constitutes possession versus distribution. That's going to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. What we often heard during the study is that today's marijuana is not the same as yesterday's marijuana. And research is being conducted to determine whether the potency has in fact changed over time. One study looked at marijuana seized by the DEA over a 20-year period, and that study found that the potency, the THC content of the marijuana material rose from about 4% in 1995 to about 12% in 2014. We also consulted with law enforcement officers in the field in regard to this question, and they indicate that anecdotally in the field they're also hearing that the quantity, or that the potency of marijuana is increasing. There's also been concern in regard to recent reports about fentanyl, which is a powerful opioid, occasionally being found mixed into marijuana, which is causing some concerns amongst law enforcement in conducting tests on plant material marijuana. In attempting to determine the impacts of decriminalization, we sought out journal articles, particularly peer-reviewed journals, to get an idea of what really happens when a state decriminalizes. Unfortunately, much of the research on that topic is outdated. There was a move toward decriminalization back in the mid to late 1970s. There was a good deal of literature produced at that time. However, currently, much of the focus tends to be on the legalization of marijuana and the medical usage of marijuana, and therefore decriminalization is somewhat fallen by the wayside in terms of the articles we were able to find in the peer-reviewed journals. As previously noted on the state map and with the state punishments, states which have gone the decriminalization route have adopted varying penalty structures, punishments, and quantity limits for simple possession of marijuana. Another concern when it relates to marijuana is the DUI aspect and marijuana or drug-impaired driving. Fortunately for the Crime Commission staff, in July of 2014, a report was produced by NHTSA to Congress, which was an overall summary of what is going on in the world of marijuana-impaired driving. They took their research as well as research from other agencies and groups on the topic and condensed it into a very good summary of the current research on that issue. And in your memo material, there's behind the PowerPoint, there's a bright green presentation, which in full for your review. In regard to marijuana levels in one's blood and the correlation between driving while impaired, science and research currently do not support a direct correlation between the number of the amount of THC in one's bloodstream and the impairment while driving. I analogize this to the DUI statute. Currently, under the DUI statute, driving while over a .08 or above is deemed to be impaired driving. There's no analogous number for marijuana. Individuals can have a high amount of marijuana in their bloodstream and not exhibit signs of impairment. Some other individuals can have a low level of marijuana or THC in their bloodstream and demonstrate significant impairment. Therefore, you cannot correlate a ratio of what THC is in your blood to how impaired you're going to be while operating a motor vehicle. Because of that reason, research and reports suggest that law enforcement may need additional training to recognize signs of drug-impaired driving because the tests for the standard field sobriety tests were generally developed with alcohol in mind, and an individual under the impairment of marijuana may struggle with those tests, but they may also be able to perform those tests fine because marijuana affects can affect the cognitive aspect as well in terms of time, depth perception, and general confusion. Any legislation regarding decriminalization would be a significant policy change in the Commonwealth of Virginia and would affect numerous areas of existing Virginia law, including areas of punishment, enforcement, trial procedures, and administrative procedures. And I'd like to spend the next few minutes going over some of these policy considerations and things that would need to be considered in regard to the movement for decriminalization. First and foremost, a penalty structure would need to be selected. Certain states like Illinois have a one-time fine, whether it's your first offense or your fifth offense. The punishment's always going to be the same. Other states have adopted an escalating civil penalty structure, much like what we saw in both Senate Bills 908 and 1269, where the first offense is a lower amount, and as you incur more and more offenses, the possibility of a fine goes higher and higher. And then the third is an escalating civil or into a criminal offense. Some states initially begin with a civil punishment, and as you progress with multiple convictions, it becomes a criminal offense. One example is Nebraska. Your first offense is a civil offense, punishable by a $300 fine, and your second, third offenses are criminal. Your second offense, I believe, up to a $400 fine and 5 days incarceration. A third offense, a $500 fine and 7 days incarceration. After selecting the penalty structure, a decision would need to be made as to exactly what amount constitutes a small amount personal use of marijuana. As you can see before you, states have adopted varying levels from approximately a third of an ounce in Illinois to approximately 3.5 ounces in Ohio. Now, looking at the predominant tends to be 1 ounce in that middle range. It's difficult chart-wise to have an idea of exactly how much an ounce was, so I brought some oregano along. I want to get chosen. But this is approximately, if my kitchen scale at home is right, approximately 1 ounce of oregano. We do have a field test kit, but I believe that's been tainted, so after determining what quantity limit would be subject to the civil penalty, a determination would also need to be made about what's going to be the punishment for possession above that civil penalty range. As I previously stated, under existing Virginia law, there is no separate distinct category in terms of quantity for possession. So once a threshold limit for civil possession was established, You'd also need to establish what the punishment is for somebody who has a simple possession charge above that civil threshold. A couple states do it differently. For example, Connecticut and Delaware give you, there's the option of incarceration as well as fine. One thing to consider with creating a weight category within the simple possession statute is that you're going to have to create weight standards and procedures. I'd liken this something like to a radar case. The radar needs to be tested and calibrated to assure accuracy, because if you have a case where you set the threshold at ½ an ounce and a defendant walks into his criminal trial with 0.6 of an ounce, a high-profile defense attorney like Delegate Lupasi is going to say, "Foundation, Judge, foundation, how do we know that scale's accurate?" So the system would need to be developed such that we can ensure any weights over that, that civil threshold can be accurately measured and introduced as evidence in court. Another consideration is the form of marijuana. Marijuana itself can come in many forms: the plant material, hashish, which is the oil it excretes, the plant excretes naturally; hashish oil, which is a chemical extraction from the plant, generally more potent than the plant material. You also are seeing in states where marijuana has been legalized, marijuana being added to various edibles, such as candies, brownies, other items. And then you have the synthetic marijuana. That's currently punished as a scheduled as a Class 1 substance in Virginia. An interesting note regarding the THC content of marijuana: there is no content limit for plant material. However, if the substance is an oily extract, the content limit is 12%. Anything more than 12% would be a felony possession of marijuana because it's a Schedule I drug. Any oil under 12% would be under the misdemeanor statute. Interesting note about that 12%, we are hearing the term oily is used in the statutes, but there are actually ways to now extract marijuana and have it into a hard substance form, whereby the THC content is significantly higher than that 12%. However, because it's not an oily substance, it falls under the definition of misdemeanor plant material as opposed to felony plant material. And as previously noted, some of the plant content itself, the lab in Virginia does not test THC content in plant material, but as you see from some of those studies, it is quite conceivable some plant material may be over that 12% as well. And as you can see below, various states have taken different paths and what forms of marijuana they have chosen to decriminalize. We wanted to get an idea of what we're seeing in Virginia in terms of what the lab is analyzing. So we got information over an 8-month span of items that contain marijuana. As you can see far away, the most were still plant-type material, either material in packaging, residue, or material in cigarettes, cigar butts. But you did see a variety of other items, such as your candy, your baked goods, such as your brownies, solid material, and other miscellaneous items. Another question that often comes up is whether law enforcement will be able to conduct searches of a vehicle based on the odor of marijuana. What we found from a large number of the surveys to prosecutors and defense attorneys is that a lot of these marijuana cases begin as a result of a traffic stop. And there's been decisions in 6 courts which have upheld law enforcement searches of vehicles, even though those states have decriminalized marijuana. Essentially, the rationale in those cases has been that marijuana remains contraband. Yes, it's a civil offense, but it's still a prohibited substance, or that there are several other illegal activities that could be related to marijuana, which still remain illegal. Cautionary note, there was a decision out of Massachusetts in which Massachusetts Supreme Court said they weren't confident that the human nose could distinguish the difference between the smell of civil possession marijuana and criminal possession marijuana. As a result, the trial court's decision to suppress the search was upheld. However, the case was remanded on other grounds related to that search. Ultimately, decriminalization would fall at some point with decisions by the court in Virginia, if that were the route the Commonwealth were to move. Before I begin that slide, there was a question that came up in regard to enforcement and how and when, who would be responsible for enforcing these marijuana laws if marijuana became a civil offense. Generally speaking, in other jurisdictions which have decriminalized marijuana, it has fallen to law enforcement in that jurisdiction to cite for possession of marijuana, civil possession. In your member material, you do have the statute from Maryland. That Maryland statute generally is a general overview of how many of the other states have chosen to work. And essentially, the statute states that law enforcement shall release the individual on a summons, and then that they'll be hearing in court. Maryland does allow an individual to prepay that marijuana offense, but my understanding from consulting with individuals in Maryland, a number of those offenses do not go to trial. Many people prepay, and when it is heard in court, many of the offices, prosecutors' offices in the state do not participate. The estimate I received was that 24 out of the 24, approximately 3 offices actually participate. Generally, it's much like a traffic offense is handled in Virginia, where the law enforcement officer is at the bar and the case is handled in that manner. There are certain statutes in Virginia which allow Virginia law enforcement to enforce civil penalties, the most notable being the refusal of a blood or breath test. That is initially a civil offense for the first offense. However, that appears in conjunction with a DUI criminal offense, where the individual is arrested for a DUI criminal offense, and then the refusal of the blood or breath test is a civil offense for the first time. There are a couple other statutes, such as this sale of tobacco and nicotine to minors, failure to display your concealed carry permit, and identification to law enforcement, and various civil noise ordinance violations. However, to the best I can determine, there's no civil equivalent of what a statewide marijuana civil enforcement would look like that Virginia law enforcement officers currently engage in. Continuing on in regard to enforcement, in light of the court decisions as to whether there's probable cause to search a vehicle based upon the odor of marijuana, questions can be raised as to whether the Commonwealth will want to keep marijuana criminalized in certain instances, such as instances where possession inside of the passenger compartment of a vehicle is a criminal offense. A couple states such as Minnesota and Mississippi, for example, possession over 1.4 ounces in Minnesota and 1 ounce in Mississippi is a criminal offense, and that's punishable by 90 days and a $1,000 fine. When you're talking about possession inside a vehicle, also raises the question, should possession in other areas also be criminalized, such as schools, public parks, government buildings? And then you have the question of, should public use or consumption be criminalized? For example, the individual who's using marijuana in the park, even if it's a civil quantity, should he still be able to use that? Certain states have addressed it differently. In New York, public use of marijuana is a criminal offense, punishable by up to 3 months incarceration and a $500 fine. In Maryland, they've chosen to make public consumption a civil offense, punishable by up to a $500 fine. Then the Virginia's drug paraphernalia statutes may need to be examined. Other states tinkered with their drug paraphernalia statutes to ensure that somebody who had, for example, a smoking device and civil marijuana did not get a criminal charge for having a smoking device that they were using to smoke their civil quantity of marijuana. Another consideration are the trial procedures. What's going to be the burden of proof? In Maryland and Connecticut, they adopted a preponderance of the evidence standard. Virginia has a, going back to the refusal of a blood or breath test, that's a civil offense for the first time. However, the standard for that offense is beyond a reasonable doubt. So a determination will need to be clarified in the code to ensure what evidentiary standard would be used at trial. You'd also need to determine how to count prior convictions. If marijuana were to be decriminalized, it's highly likely to have the individual on a civil possession offense who may have 1 or 2 prior convictions for criminal possession of marijuana. How are you going to count that civil offense? Will it be a first-time civil offense where the civil penalties take place, or will it be an escalator into the third or subsequent offense? One state took a look at this, Vermont, and what they did was essentially wipe the slate clean for everybody. Said as of this date when decriminalization becomes effective, none of the priors count, basically hitting the reset button and everybody starts from 0. Another decision to be made with who's going to prosecute, the Commonwealth Attorney, the County Attorney, or much like what we've heard from Maryland and what you see in traffic cases in Virginia, is it going to be the law enforcement officer at the bar handling the civil offense without the involvement of a Commonwealth Attorney or somebody to prosecute. Discovery process would need to be clarified. Calling it a civil offense could create the question of whether civil or criminal discovery rules apply. And then finally, the determination would need to be made as to whether a civil violation is going to be grounds for revocation of probation or a suspended sentence, because you can see one court using it as grounds, another handling it in a different manner. Rhode Island looked at this issue and explicitly noted in their decriminalization legislation that a civil marijuana violation is not grounds for probation or parole revocation. Another important question is the administrative procedures following court, following any type of violation, finding, or conviction. If some type of escalating penalty structure is enacted, a determination needs to be made about which agency is going to hold the records of that civil violation or civil conviction. For any type of escalating penalty structure, it's paramount to have those records readily available to law enforcement, whoever issues this charge or summons, so that they can accurately indicate what number of offense that this individual is being charged with, to know what penalty structure is going to apply. I draw your attention to the statute regarding sale of tobacco or nicotine products to minors. That statute is a civil offense with an escalating penalty structure. The first offense is up to a $100 fine, second to $200, third to $500. We were curious as to how those records are tracked and maintained, and best of what we determined that they are not. That there's no repository for those records. So an individual hypothetically could be convicted in Richmond, move to Fairfax, commit that offense again, and nobody would have any easy access to know whether that was first or second without checking each individual court page across the Commonwealth. Another determination to be made would be in regard to whether this civil violation will count as a conviction for purpose of certain firearm statutes, such as the purchase or transportation of a handgun or obtaining a concealed handgun permit. That was addressed in Senate Bill 1269, where the possession of marijuana was decriminalized, but the civil offense was still counted as a conviction for purposes of those firearm statutes. Another area to examine would be the Virginia DUI laws. Currently, a conviction can be obtained for driving under the influence of alcohol, under the influence of drugs, or under the influence of a combination of drugs and alcohol. A conviction could be obtained for driving under the impairment of marijuana, provided that you had a blood lab to show that the individual actually did have marijuana in their system, as well as testimony from an individual, commonly the law enforcement officer, as to the signs and degree of impairment a driver was exhibiting. In your member material behind, I believe it is slide 7, there is, slide 7, there is the DUI blood lab showing a marijuana test. And what you'll note on that blood lab, there are two indicators of marijuana that will show up in your system. There's the THC and then the THC carboxyl acid, I believe it's pronounced. But the THC itself is the active component with the psychoactive effects. That will generally stay in your bloodstream for about 8 hours. However, the byproducts and the metabolites that are broken down from that can remain in your system for weeks following the ingestion of marijuana. In examining the blood or the DUI statutes, you could hypothetically add blood levels to the existing DUI statute. There are other states, I believe, according to the Governor's Highway Safety Association, there are approximately 18 states which have put some type of THC blood number into their DUI statutes. However, as previously indicated, those numbers are not supported by science. There's no correlation between that number and the degree of impairment, so adding such a number could create the risk of an individual who's not impaired by marijuana being convicted of a driving under the influence of marijuana offense. Another issue to be examined is the driver's license. As previously noted, any conviction for possession of marijuana or any deferred disposition in that first offender program results in a 6-month revocation of the offender's license. That was subject to change with legislation that passed last session, whereby additional community service would be imposed in lieu of suspending the driver's license. However, there was a second enactment clause in which Virginia wanted a written assurance from the Federal Highway Administration that Virginia wouldn't lose funding. As of this date, have not received those written assurances. The Virginia, in terms of the driver's license suspension, while the driver's license is suspended, the court does have the authority to issue a restricted license for a variety of purposes listed in the statute, such as driving to and from work, to and from medical appointments, probation, various other factors which the court can consider. Along the same lines of the license issue is the federal highway funding issue. Per the Virginia Department of Transportation annual expected budget, Virginia receives slightly over $1 billion in the federal fund. The federal highway funding statutes themselves explicitly require states to either suspend a drug offender's license for 6 months or in the alternative to opt out of that suspension requirement. Virginia has not opted out of that suspension requirement. Therefore, we would, under those funding guidelines in the federal statute, Virginia would need to continue suspending the driver's license or risk an 8% loss in certain streams of federal funding. We attempted to determine how much federal funding could potentially be jeopardized. In your packet, this would be under tab 7 of your packet. We do have a bill from 2015, Senate Bill 1444, which would have removed the driver's license suspension on marijuana cases. However, as you'll note from reading over that impact statement, there was a significant fiscal impact if the Federal Highway Administration were to determine that Virginia wasn't compliant with federal statutes related to highway funding. I believe the figure in that estimated approximately $68 million. Finally, what's going on with marijuana at the federal level? Federal level marijuana is also a Schedule I drug. Back in August of 2016, the Drug Enforcement Administration opted to deny a petition to reschedule the marijuana to Schedule II so that medical research could be performed on the drug. Therefore, as it sits now, it is a Schedule I drug, and attempts to have it reclassified have not been successful. There have been measures introduced in both chambers of Congress to have marijuana removed from the federal controlled substance list. But overall, the current direction of the federal marijuana policy currently remains unclear. Stepping away from these policy considerations, as previously noted, staff did request various data in regard to arrests, charges, and convictions for possession of marijuana offenses. I'd like to touch briefly on what some of that data showed. Over the past 10 years, there were over 130,000 arrests for possession of marijuana. a vast majority of those arrests were for the first offense possession. The chart before you illustrates how arrests for possession of marijuana have changed over the past 10 years, with first offense arrests being the blue line and second or subsequent offense arrests being the red line. When breaking down these arrests by sex, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that Virginia is approximately 50-50 male-female. However, the arrest data indicates that the vast majority of individuals arrested for possession of marijuana first offense are male, and an even higher majority of those arrested for second or subsequent offense are male. As you'll see in the chart before you, this breaks arrests down by age category, and the majority of individuals that are arrested for possession of marijuana fall within that 18 to 24-year-old age category. We looked at Census Bureau estimates of how Virginia breaks down population-wise in regard to race, and this before you is how what the racial composition of Virginia is. When looking at the arrests based upon the race of the offender, what we noted was slightly over half of the individuals arrested for a first offense possession charge were white, slightly less than half of those individuals arrested for first offense possession were black. When you looked at arrests for second or subsequent offense possession, over half of those arrested were black, and slightly less than half of those arrested were white. This chart before you illustrates the breakdown of that data by race for these second or subsequent offense arrests. Clearly, there is some disparity seen in those arrest rates in light of the population breakdown. What we wanted, the next logical question is, why are we seeing such a disparity? There are a couple of theories which have been advanced on that topic. The first being a racial inequality theory. That theory posits that back during the 1970s and 1980s, you started seeing a scaling back of industry. As a result of this scale back, minorities were disproportionately affected and therefore rendered more vulnerable to drug use, drug addiction, and dealings within the illicit drug trade for money purposes. The second theory put forth the area of residence. This was the idea that due to socioeconomic factors, minorities are more likely to live in urban areas. And within those urban areas in which they live, there's a lack of private space. And due to the lack of private space, much of the drug use and drugs transactions occur in public areas. This condensed area of drug use and drug transaction comes with some type of profit for somebody, so you see gangs and organized crime coming into those areas and attempt to profiteer off the drug trade, which in turn draws law enforcement into those areas to enforce drug laws. And as a result of the compact area of residence coupled with the higher likelihood of contact with law enforcement, an individual residing in such an area is more likely to be arrested for a drug offense. Third is the conscious, subconscious racial bias theory. What this theory really goes back to is the war on drugs. In the war on drugs, a lot of emphasis was placed on enforcement, and law enforcement was provided a good deal of discretion in terms of enforcing these drug laws. So you take that war on drugs, coupled with another theory that individuals may be, based upon stereotypical beliefs, individuals may conduct their behavior consistently with those beliefs, even if those beliefs may not be true. And the theory puts forth that one of these beliefs is that minorities tend to be a higher